It's my pleasure to introduce Andrew Inkpen, who is an associate professor at Mount Allison University. I was mix up the place of the university there, and is now Secretary Treasurer of the Canadian Society for the History and Philosophy of Science. Andrew is a philosopher of science and I guess sort of true HPS person, sometimes does philosophy of science, sometimes in true history, who works on ecology, evolutionary biology, specifically in the context of microbial and molecular biology, and on the intersection of philosophy of health as well. I think we're going to hear some of that today. I feel like I should advertise for him that he's had a book come out in the last few years, Can Microbial Communities Regenerate on UChicago, co-authored with Ford Doolittle, and Andrew, in addition to myself and Celso, is one of the acolytes of Ford Doolittle. Andrew's also helped contribute to a number of ideas in the philosophy of molecular evolution over the years. I should probably leave there. Please take over for us, Andrew.
Thank you so much. And thanks to everybody for coming. I was here last time I was in Exeter, I think it was 10 years ago, for a conference on the artificial and the natural. Was anybody here then? Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Anyway, that was a great conference. It was the last time I was here, but it was a lovely opportunity. So thanks for inviting me back. Okay, yeah, I'll just say at the outset, I'm totally not a philosopher of medicine. So this is like recent steps in that direction for me, building on some stuff that I already do know about. Okay, so this is where I'm headed today. So microbiome scientists and those that are influenced by them understand the relation between microorganisms and human health, usually through one of two frameworks: an ecosystem services framework or an ecosystem health framework. But I'm going to suggest that making it a choice between those two frameworks is to collapse two conceptual distinctions. And when we pull those distinctions apart, we can see that there's an additional framework. And then at the end of the talk, the last third, I want to explore some aspects of that framework and then suggest it has some advantages and consider an objection. Okay, the takeaway here, if there's a takeaway, is relationality rather than holism. The takeaway. Okay, so this is the outline. That's where I'm gonna go through. Okay, so starting with microbiome science. Microbiome science uses omics technologies to describe the compositions and functions of communities of microorganisms that are at a location. So human microbiome science studies those communities that are associated with habitats that are in or on the human body. And one of the guiding themes of this research, of course, is to understand the role of the composition and function of microbiomes in the health and illness of their human hosts. The science is relatively recent, so beginning in the early 2000s, and really with the development of the technologies that made this study possible. One of the influential coinings of the term microbiome was by the Nobel laureate Joshua Lederberg in 2001 to, quote, signify the ecological community of commensal, symbiotic, and pathogenic microorganisms that literally share our body space and have been all but ignored as determinants of health and disease. And I think it's pretty crazy that someone could have written that in 2000, because of course, ignored no more are these things. This is now sort of everywhere. The microbiome has really kind of exploded, especially among self-help books. Here's just like a Google search of microbiome, and you get all these self-help books. Jonathan Eisen, who's the microbiome scientist, has called this microbiomania. This explosion comes on the back of a huge amount of funding. So the US government funded, invested between the years of 2007 and 2016, more than $1 billion in microbiome research, which included funding the Human Microbiome Project. And that public funding went hand in hand with like soaring industry investments and the creation of a number of companies that will give you personalized analyses of microbiome composition, such as the microbiome of your gut, and with sort of like I would say dubious connections to one's health. Oversold or not, though, and despite all that hype, it's true that the study of microbiomes has changed how many now think about animal and plant biology. So this is true because evidence is showing that interactions with microbes are central to the proper development and functioning of animals. Without microbes, animals do not develop properly, their immune systems do not work properly, they cannot perform digestion properly or normally, they are more prone to illness and pathogens, and so on and so on. Angela Douglas, who wrote a textbook for microbiome science a couple of years ago, puts this in a sort of rather dramatic way, saying, these considerations, a further and far from trivial consequence is the extensive rewriting of the next edition of every physiology textbook and undergraduate lecture course. That is to take into consideration the results of microbiome science. So animal biology, human biology needs to be rethought and updated in given these results. I don't think that should be all that surprising to most of us, given that animals evolved in a world that was already full of microorganisms and their products. But for much of the history of medicine, the goal has been to eradicate bacteria through antibiotics and sanitation. And that's led by the assumption that bacteria are bad, pathogenic causes of disease and illness. And of course, some bacteria are best understood as pathogenic. Spirochetes in the genus Borrelia cause Lyme disease, which is a nasty disorder. And tuberculosis is one of the causes of tuberculosis. So there are some that are best thought of in this way. But we've really discovered that many are helpful and others essential for healthy animals. The early history of microbiome science really went hand in hand with demands to think in more nuanced ways about our relation to our microorganisms. And that was, for instance, one of the reasons behind advancing the idea of the microbiome that Letterberg himself had. He was particularly concerned to advocate for what he called the war no more approach to microorganisms, which he published about a lot in the early 2000s. And his point was that we need to stop waging a war, this sort of scorched earth idea against bacteria, assuming they're all bad. Microbiome, he thought, would be a way of encouraging a sort of more thoughtful consideration of microbes. And of course, there's now a considerable amount of research that investigates the ways that a number of quote unquote modern illnesses, IBD, autoimmune disorders, diabetes, so on, asthma, might be partly a result of modern Western ways of living that led to a disappearance of microorganisms that were historically a part of our environment and potentially helpful or important for our health. And accordingly, there's lots of efforts now for microbial conservation. So finding these old microbes and saving them before they are all destroyed. I'm not going to comment on any of this stuff really. As a way of thinking in more nuanced ways about our relations to and our dependence on microbes, many see microbiome science as encouraging us to think more ecologically about the human body and about health. It's a really common theme in a lot of the literature. One of the emphases is to see health as partly a matter of one's ability to cultivate the communities of microorganisms of which one is composed, like tending a garden. So this, it's funny that the example of grass shows up because grass is like a monoculture and you wouldn't want a monoculture in your gut. But anyway, it's an example that shows up a lot. And in these examples, like health is trying to be conceptualized in ecological terms as well as physiological terms. That's the way that a lot of people think about it. Here's a quotation the sort of thing you encounter a lot. So, with this new paradigm, the human body can be considered akin to a national park. The management of the ecology of the human microbiota becomes the focus of both prevention and therapeutics. And I'll just give you two more quotes. The traditional perspective in clinical medicine has been to think of the human body as a battleground on which physicians attack pathogens. We suggest that human medicine has more in common with park management than it does with a battlefield strategy. And the bottom one is, The emerging view of humans as ecosystems raises the question of whether approaches developed to improve the health of natural ecosystems may help to advance gut medicine. So you see this kind of, we need to move to a more ecological approach all over the place in the literature. But if we look a little more closely at both of these examples, there's a slightly different emphasis in the top one than the bottom one. I call the top emphasis an ecosystem services framework, building on the ideas of traditional ecology, and the bottom one, sort of ecosystem health type framework for thinking about health. So I'm going to say a little bit more about these frameworks first, and then I'll come back to some examples. Okay. I'll start with the ecosystem services. So ecosystem services framework encourages us to think in the following way, that microbes are components of our human environment, and their activities can be causally relevant to or contribute to the production of the health and illness of their human hosts. In this framework, microbes provide services for us. A health state is ascribed to the human individual host, and interventions in these examples aim at restoring the services that microbes provide to us as hosts. That's one way, a common way of thinking ecologically about health. Another way is through a slightly different emphasis and a different framework. This is where humans plus some microbes are said to make up an ecosystem, so a larger whole. The activities, capacities of humans and microbes are then co-constitutive of the health of the ecosystem, this larger thing. These components make up rather than bring about health states. I'll come back to that language later on. In this case, a health state is ascribed to the whole ecosystem, and interventions are said to are attempts to restore ecosystem level capacities. So slightly different frameworks that people draw attention to in the microbiome science literature of ways that we might think more ecologically about human health, coming from traditional ecology. Okay, I've been convinced by a whole bunch of recent work in philosophy of medicine, including this recent book by Elizabeth Barnes, that the concept of health is just incredibly messy, that there's no one thing that is our health, that the concept does all kinds of different work in different contexts, serves different interests, and we ask it to do a whole bunch of tension-ridden things. So as a result of all of that work in the background, I think it would be wrong to see these two frameworks as competing in the sense of being mutually exclusive ways of thinking about our health. I think they can be complementary alternatives, each better than the other at capturing different things about what matter to us about our health. So that's the way in which I think about it. Okay, so let me say a little bit about that services way of thinking first. So there are some advantages to adopting a ecosystem services framework for thinking about human health. The first is a pretty simple one, and that's just that it connects health research to existing theory in ecology, which is relevant for understanding human health, but might otherwise be missed. This is often theory in restoration ecology or in community ecology or meta-community ecology. Here's an example of doing this kind of thing. This is from 2018. The authors explain how gut microbiota can be a source of ecosystem services for us, such as the production of short-chain fatty acids in our gut. And then they use that connection to suggest how findings in classic restoration ecology might be relevant for thinking about human disease and treatment. I won't go into the details here about this sort of framework, but the point is just that this way of thinking can be kind of generative of new hypotheses and new ways of thinking about what matters and how we might treat people. Another way of doing this is to, as these authors do, to use theory in community ecology to shed light on ecological succession. That's the building of an ecological community, the assembly of an ecological community over time. And in this case, they're interested in the assembly of the gut community following a disturbance like antibiotics. And their point is that different different types of community ecological frameworks and theories might be relevant for different kinds of gut assemblies. So again, the point is that this can be quite generative of theory that might be relevant for human health following something like antibiotic treatment, but that might otherwise be missed in a health context because we're not used to thinking about ecology. Okay. Other advantages. It highlights that microbes are not all bad, but can provide essential services required for human health and well-being, which is a big impetus, this microbiome science. It highlights that services can be provided by a whole community rather than just one species. I'll come back to these examples of pathogen protection and digestion below. The idea is that the service is not produced by one member of the microbial community, but a host of a whole bunch of different members from that community. I'll come back to those examples. And this view is generally supportive of this war no more attitude that seems so important amongst people who are in this field. That is really being careful about our relation to our microorganisms and antimicrobial products and so on. The services framework can also be thought of quite widely and can be applied in other contexts. So one place where this gets applied is in honeybee health. So honeybees have a small but pretty stable microbial community that lives in their guts that is really important for their health and well-being. They use that term. It's actually put quotes on that. Well-being of the bees. One of the things that this research has shown is that agricultural chemicals that are advertised as not affecting insects do in some cases affect the honeybee's community in its gut, and therefore affect the honeybee, which they provide services for the honeybee provides services for us, and so in the end can sort of affect the services that we are provided with too. And so taking an ecosystem services framework can sort of attune us to those kinds of concerns that we might have. Okay, so that's really all I want to say about that services framework, maybe until the very end. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about this other way, this ecosystem health way of thinking. There's this feeling that one gets when one reads the science and the wider community of humanities scholars that the services framework leaves something out. And the word that's often used here for what's left out is interdependence. Okay. I'll just say as an aside that the bioethicist Nikolai Maurer has done a great job of fleshing out this idea of interdependence with a number of different co-authors in a few different places, and particularly in the context of the One Health way of thinking. So if you're curious, look to his work. He tells a much fuller story than I do here. I'm just going to focus on one aspect, but just to sort of shout out to that work. Okay, this idea that interdependence is really important goes way back. So this is how an early News and Views article in Nature put it in 2006. They say, a metagenomic analysis of the microbes in the human gut reveals their diversity and just how interdependent we are on them. Together with our microbes, we are a human bacterial superorganism with immense metabolic diversity and capacity. Okay, and so here and in related pieces, the idea is that because some of our microbes, because some of our metabolic capacities, here we're talking about digestion, involve chemical reactions that are completed by microorganisms rather than human cells, the bearer of those capacities is better thought of as the superorganism. Okay, so it's the microbes plus humans, and that's what interdependence means. To give kind of one more specific neat example, it's a very well-worn example, so you may have heard this one before, but it is neat, and it's on the digestion theme. Some Japanese people carry in their guts a strain of bacterium that has genes for carbohydrate metabolism of a really specific kind. And those genes were transferred from an ocean-dwelling bacterium that metabolizes similar compounds on marine red algae. That algae includes species that are used in the making of nori, which is frequently eaten in Japan. So because of this, This is what Mora writes in one place about this. Because of this, the Japanese gut can uniquely derive energy from a certain algae-based diet. Crucially, this specific feature of digestion has little to do with human genetics. The difference between their ability to have it and ours, lacking it, has little to do with human genetics. Thus, there's a strong sense in which the microbiome extends the physiological process of digestion and makes available to the human body a series of calories that the host could not have otherwise extracted by its own internal means. Okay. Morer and another co-author argue that this kind of research really demonstrating this idea of metabolic interdependence motivates a hypothesis of extended health. That the bearers of health and disease states, just like in that earlier News and Views article, are these they call them these dynamic functional units, the human plus its microorganisms. That health should be ascribed to that whole entity, call it a superorganism or whatever you want. That emphasis is really common, this idea that there's this cases of interdependence and they motivate an account of health at the level of a whole, ecosystem level whole. So this is, I'll just give you a few more examples. This is an example from a recent PNAS piece. A lot of these people are major figures in the field of microbiome science, major scientists. And they consistently now use human meta-organism health rather than just human health, where the meta-organism health refers to the health of this whole collective, the entire ecological collective, human plus microbes. You see this emphasis, this is another example in a bioessays piece. The authors write, the development of patient-tailored medical applications should not view human individuals as the sole targets of climate change-related health interventions because of these examples of interdependence. Instead, the collective of the holobiont, that is this whole entity, should be considered a potential patient in these cases. So that's the level at which we ascribe health. And this shows up in popular places too. This is just an example from The Guardian, but it pops up all over the place. Here, the journalist writes, while we can't see our tiny brethren, research has revealed their fundamental role in keeping us healthy and happy. Genetically speaking, we are more microbe than human. Even if we only count the microbes that live on our skin, we have more bacterial genes than we do human genes. Together, we are a superorganism. And that is now the proper locus of thinking about health and illness. Okay. So really, I think one way to categorize all of these views together, whether they call it meta-organism, ecosystem, holobiont, superorganism, is to say that they're adopting something like an ecosystem health framework. So I think their thinking goes like this. Because health-related capacities like digestion depend on components of our environment, it is more accurate to treat the larger system, the ecosystem, as possessing the capacity. In these cases, the larger system is the, or an, at least, appropriate locus of health and illness ascription. Now, the overtone in a lot of these pieces is that this is the right way, this is the new right way to think about health, given the science, and that the ecosystem services framework leaves out this idea of interdependence, and so is in some way incorrect. But I think there's a more reasonable way of thinking about this in terms of explanation. Okay. So I'm just going to say a few general and quick words about explanation. First, philosophers sometimes find it helpful to draw a distinction between what they call ideological explanation and constitutive explanation. So I'll just say something about each of these categories. So roughly, according to ideological explanation, or when we're giving an ideological explanation, we're explaining an event on the basis of the preceding events that brought it about, the things that caused it. The explanandum, the thing we're explaining, is some event. And the explanans there are the preceding or antecedent events that brought it about. In a constitutive explanation, we're explaining a causal capacity of a system on the basis of the causal capacities of the parts that make up that system. In this case, the explanandum is a causal capacity of some system, a disposition to act in a certain way under certain circumstances. And the explanans is the causal capacities of the parts and their organization. Slightly different ways of explaining. Okay, so here's my take on what I think is going on with this interdependence claim and with this split in the literature. Ecosystem health analyses are in the business of providing constitutive explanations. The explanandum in these cases is certain health-related capacities, and they explain why a system has these health-related capacities, for example, the capacity to digest, on the basis of the causal capacities of the parts and the organization that make up that system. I think that's what ecosystem health analyses are in the business of. Ecosystem service analyses are really in the business of a slightly different kind of explanation. They're in the business of ideological explanation. So the explanandum is really the production of health-related services. So for example, digestible molecules. And they explain the production of these health-related services on the basis of how microbial activities and microbes work to bring them about. Okay, so two different kinds of explanation that seem important. We can sort of see this when we look back at the ecosystem services table that I had put up there earlier from this piece in the Quarterly Review of Biology. And they frequently explain the services by employing a kind of causal language, which makes you think they're doing something like providing an ideological explanation. They talk about microbes producing, microbes preventing, microbes regulating, and they seem mostly to be interested in these ideological explanations, the production of certain services for us. Okay, and so one way to understand, and I've been trying to understand this motivation for this ecosystem health framework, one way to understand it is to say that sometimes what we are interested in understanding or explaining is these health-related capacities of the system, and that some of these are better understood as capacities of a whole ecosystem. This is, I think, plausibly what this interdependence point is really about. Okay, that seems to pop up all over the place. Okay, I'm going to talk about a few problems for the ecosystem health way of thinking about framing. Okay, so despite, I think, increasing popularity to move towards this sort of ecosystem health position, and its ability to render these sort of constitutive explanations comprehensible, I think there are some downsides to thinking in this way about human health. Okay. I wrote a piece recently where I really focused on criticizing the ecosystem health approach and some of the downsides to it. So there's a much longer story to be said here, but I'm just going to make a point that there's a few downsides in this case. So the first one is that in most cases, to say that we care about the health of the whole ecosystem is disingenuous because we really privilege the health of the host member of that ecosystem. So that's just to say that the health is indexed to the host member, its success, flourishing, functioning, welfare, whatever. Okay, and so for example, research has shown that a healthy human microbiome is not a stable thing over time and across people, compositionally speaking. The microbes that make up healthy human microbiomes change over time and are different between people. So who's there in these communities differs. Classically, the data have been presented like this. So different humans are along the horizontal axis there, and the different microbes making up their microbiomes are represented by the different colors that they have. And this is true even when we sort of zoom out to the phylum level. So quite far out if you're like, so to speak. But despite that taxonomic variation that you see between people, healthy people, healthy humans, the microbes of healthy humans seem to perform similar functions across people and over time. So again, different humans are represented along the horizontal axis, and the similar functions are represented by the same color bars across. Okay, so it's clear that health is maintained then when unrelated microbes performing the same functions are substituted one for another. Seems clear given the research. But if that's true, and we're thinking about this in terms of ecosystem health, then why say that health must be constant why say that the human must be constant for health state to stay maintained? If bacteria as individual organisms can sort of sub in and out, why not allow that the human organism could be subbed in and out and health maintained? Sort of a little thought experiment, I guess. And I think there's an obvious reason why we can't perform that and that it seems absurd, and that's that we care about the health is indexed to the human member. We care about the human member of that ecosystem community. Health of the ecosystem is indexed to the health of the human host. It's just host-centric. And so health is really not about the persistence of the capacities of this whole ecosystem, only those that are indexed to the health of the human. As an aside, and if you are thinking about sort of traditional ecology, this is in fact why some traditional ecologists have been skeptical of ecosystem health approaches in general. The idea is that what sounds like it's really about the welfare of a whole ends up being about the health and well-being of one member of that community, namely the human. And so it seems it's disingenuous or could be used to do for nefarious things, I guess. Okay. The second problem, so the first problem, the indexing and the disingenuousness. The second problem is that thinking in more nuanced ways about microbes means acknowledging that their interests and activities only contingently align with our own. And that fits sort of awkwardly with an ecosystem health approach that puts them in the same ecosystem as us. So it seems crucial that we recognize that microbes and humans are separate systems with potentially divergent interests. And there's a number of different examples one could give here. There are an issue raised by bacteria with both positive and negative effects on human health. A famous example here is H. pylori. So this is a bacteria that lives in the human stomach. In fact, it apparently only lives in human stomachs. Interesting. And it can lead to stomach ulcers and stomach cancer in a small subset of people, which was found out in the early 20th century. But, and so sometimes it's bad. But more recent evidence is suggesting that H. pylori may play a positive role, for instance, in inhibiting esophageal cancer and esophageal diseases, and potentially also in playing a role in working the immune system for proper development of the immune system so you don't develop things like asthma. Martin Blazer, who is the person working on this particular organism, says that in a world of black and white, H. pylori is gray, sort of in between. Some positive negative effects, some negative ones. Opportunistic pathogens are another example here. So for instance, species that are members of the group Viridin strep are persistent colonizers of the human body. And they can be favorable to us, but they sometimes cause disease. So for example, they often exist in the mouth microbiome, but if they escape from the mouth and make it into the bloodstream, they can cause endocarditis in the heart. So in this case, the bacteria are really just taking advantage of their new situation, but at the expense of the human host. Okay, so the ecosystem framework then might encourage sort of treating microbes as parts of this ecosystem, yet it's equally necessary that we understand that they are separate entities with potentially separate and divergent interests. If the ecosystem health framework then encourages a kind of binary thinking, then that's at odds with a much more nuanced view that we might need to have towards microorganisms. So it sort of oversimplifies a case by making it seem more holistic than it really is, and might be counterproductive for that reason. Okay, so those are two problems I have with this ecosystem health way of thinking about human health. Okay. So in summary, where I'm at so far, how did I start? Like 3:30? I think I was told 4:15. Okay. So in summary, the ecosystem services framework works well, but many people in the field think that it leaves something out, and that's usually put it in the name of interdependence. And I've fleshed this out in terms of this is constitutive explanations of health-related capacities that draw on components of our environment. So they really advocate moving then from an ecosystem services framework to this ecosystem health framework, where health is ascribed to this whole ecosystem, of which we are just one member. But that framework fits the bill awkwardly, as I was trying to just make point. Okay. Fortunately, I don't think they need to go that far as ascribing health to an entire ecosystem. And they can still be making a useful and interesting claim nonetheless, and one that sort of subverts a common understanding or traditional image of our health as being disconnected from our environment and purely about physiology. Put simply, I think they collapse two distinctions, but they don't need to. So I'll just put these on two axes because it's an easy way to visualize what's going on here. So one distinction, my allergies are so bad in this part of the world that like by 3:30 every day, I just lose my voice. Regardless of like how much allergy meds I take. So they're all users. It's the chaos. There's got to be a joke about microbes in there, but
Yeah.
so these two distinctions. So one distinction is about whether we treat microorganisms as components of the system to which we ascribe health, that is, as parts, or whether we treat them as components of our environment. Okay. Another distinction, a separate distinction, is whether we treat microbes as producing health-related services versus whether we treat them as constitutive of health-related capacities. So the ecosystem services framework then would occupy that box. It treats microbes as producing services that are related to our health states and as components of our environment. Okay. The ecosystem health framework occupies that box. It treats some microbes as parts of an ecosystem and co-constitutive of the health-related capacities of that ecosystem. So it's in that box. And the novel argumentative move that a lot of people are making in this field is to go from that box, to follow that arrow, to go from the services to the health approach. But because they collapse those two distinctions, it might look like those are the only two options available. Okay, but when we draw those distinctions, you can see that there's a third option there. And according to this option, microbes are considered components of a human or host's environment, but they're still constitutive of health-related capacities of the human host. Okay, so it's possible to be in that little box there. So I've used the word relational here. That gets used a lot in a lot of different contexts. I took it from feminist discussions of autonomy that roughly draw a similar set of distinctions and then use that label, but we can come back to the label relational at the end if you want. So it's not my phrase. Okay. Let me say a little bit about this relational framework and then draw attention to one objection to it that I think helps us see what's going on with it. So let me just, we talked about this digestion case earlier on, so let's just go back to the digestion case. And recall that the point there was that differences in the digestive capacities of humans can be due to differences in the microbes in their guts, not differences in their genetics. Okay, so thinking relationally would be to adopt a framework like this. Digestion is a health-related capacity of the human host, meaning that it's a capacity that we monitor and treat in a health context, which is primarily concerned about the functioning, welfare, flourishing, whatever functioning of humans. That the capacity is explained by the capacities of the components that constitute that capacity, where some of those components are not parts of the human. Okay, so this is a constitutive explanation, and so different from the ideological explanations that are provided by an ecosystem services framework. So it is an inappropriate framework for explaining how microbes produce digestible molecules that humans use. But it is an appropriate framework for explaining differences in the capacities of digestion for different people. So rather than postulate some higher level ecosystem that possesses this capacity and is the subject of health description, then the relational framework instead just allows that components of our environment can feature in explanations of our human capacities, health-related capacities. Okay, so, and in that sense, it's relational. I'll give you another example because this is another one of the interdependence points that's often drawn. This is the example of pathogen resistance. So one case here is that of C. difficile. C. diff is a type of bacteria that's often found in the human gut. It's in a lot of children's human guts under 5. And less so in adults, but still found in quite a number. But it can lead to infection, and when it does, it's very difficult to treat and leads to life-threatening bouts of diarrhea that are very bad. This infection sometimes occurs in people who have taken broad-spectrum antibiotics, often will be treated in the hospital for a totally unrelated injury, infection. And the thinking is this, that when they take these broad-spectrum antibiotics, the resident microbes in their guts are sort of wiped out. And when they're killed off, the C. diff has nothing to compete with it within that community. And so it gains enough of a footing in that environment to grow a large enough population that it causes human harm. Okay. So resistance to the pathogen, of which exists in our environment, and as I said, most children under 5 have in their guts, is thought to be in part provided by the possession of an intact, relatively normal microbial community in the gut. It's doing the work of also resisting this particular illness. And so one very successful treatment, much more so than antibiotics, because it just tends to recur if you take antibiotics, is FMT, or fecal microbiota transplantation, where you transfer a microbial community through a stool sample from a healthy donor to the inflicted person, and that helps to relieve the symptoms of C. diff. Okay. So a relational framework would think about this in the following way. The pathogen resistance and recovery capacity of humans is explained both by the capacities of the human cells, the immune system cells say, and the capacities and organization of the community of microorganisms that make up the gut. That capacity is thus co-constituted by parts and components of one's environment. Our health is, with regard to this particular health-related capacity, then relational in that sense. Okay. So I think as a framework for thinking about human health and the meaning of microbiome science, the relational framework has some benefits, relative benefits over the other frameworks. One, you get sort of constitutive explanations that have seemed important without the drawbacks of the disingenuous and, I think, counterproductive holism of the ecosystem health framework. It avoids that problem of indexing because it's really the human flourishing, success, welfare that matters when determining health status. It encourages recognizing a sort of independence, because there's still components of our environment between microbes and humans, so that it doesn't at least go against the idea of thinking about them as having only contingently aligned interests. And that has seemed necessary for thinking in nuanced ways about microorganisms. And it encourages us to attend to things that we might otherwise miss, that our health depends on components of our environment to a deep sense. Okay. So that's the relational framework. I want to raise an objection that I think helps to bring out a little bit more of this framework. So I've heard objections to proposals of this kind in general, and that is that they lack boundedness. They lack a kind of boundedness. So if we allow, the objection might go, that our health-related capacities are constituted by components of our environment, then this sort of like opens the floodgates. Our ability to digest, of course, also depends on our breathing oxygen, which also depends on the photosynthetic capacities of plants. So are plants and their photosynthetic capacities then components of our health or our health-related capacities? This, to some people, seems like an absurdity, or perhaps it just renders the framework sort of nearly trivial in that it's just like, of course, health-related capacities depend on the environment and our context. Like we already knew that, something. Okay, so I think that's the objection, sort of lacking of boundedness objection. And I think there's a few things to be said in response to this objection. The first is just so what? That's the first one. So I said at the start that different frameworks for health can highlight different things, and perhaps the relational framework is just particularly good at highlighting the fragility of our health and our dependence on our environment and context. Surely this is what the One Health movement is all about, and might counter some naive thinking that we are more independent than we really are and we depend a lot more than we really think on other things. So the first answer is just sort of like, so what? F off. The second one is, I think we can give a slightly different response, which I think is better for more convincingly countering what might be the main impetus behind this objection. And that's that the framework's just sort of trivial or unwieldy in a way that's unhelpful. And I think this response can come from exploiting resources that are already developed in the causal explanation literature. And this is ideas about difference making and sensitivity, and I'll just talk about the difference making ones right now. Okay, so I'm going to illustrate this with the difference making point drawing on some of the philosopher Ken Waters' distinctions. So this response comes from noting that a similar problem really, you can raise a similar problem to causal explanation. And it's sometimes called the problem of causal parity. So if the striking of a match and the presence of oxygen are both required for the match to light, are these factors then on a causal par when it comes to producing the lighting? We seem to want to say that in the case of lighting a match, it was the striking that was the cause of the match lighting. But the question is, on what grounds can we say that, given that the presence of oxygen is also required and counterfactually dependent on the, or the lighting is counterfactually dependent on the oxygen? Okay, so Waters' point was we can distinguish causes if we pick out a population of entities which differ and then ask which was the actual difference maker in that population of entities. So in the case of the match, a reasonable population is the box of matches, the lit one and the other ones that aren't there. And the cause that made the actual difference between the unlighted and the lit match was the striking, not the presence of oxygen. The presence of oxygen was a potential difference maker in that there was no oxygen and wouldn't have lit. But it did not make the actual difference in the population that we're considering. The actual difference was made by the striking match. And so in this case, the causes are not on par in this explanation if we focus on a particular population. So I think that given that I think the objection to the relational theory is analogous to this, except it's about constitutive rather than causal explanation. And I think it can be answered in an analogous way. So the problem might be stated like this, to put it in an analogous way. If both the capacities of trees producing oxygen and the capacities of microbes are required for digestion, aren't we committed to the idea that these factors are sort of on a constitutive par when it comes to our health-related capacities? And the answer is no. Our population, in this case, if we define a population, our population is humans with different digestive capacities. And although it's true that the capacities of trees is a potential difference maker with regard to our capacity to digest, in that biomedical context that we're considering, the actual difference maker is the capacity, the actual difference maker, the capacity of a part that makes the difference between being able to digest a certain molecule and not, is the presence of microorganisms with certain capacities. Capacity was said a lot there, but anyway, I hope you follow that point roughly. So the point of this is that employing a relational framework when considering human health does mean that human states are constituted by components of our environment. But this does not need to be problematically unwieldy or undisciplined, because once we focus on the specific health-related capacities in actual populations, we can see that not all components are explanatorily equal. Okay, so in conclusion then, I think the relational framework is worth considering along with the other ways of thinking about human health that acknowledge the work of microbiome science and that are sort of broadly ecological. And furthermore, I think that the relational framework has a lot of the same benefits that the ecosystem health framework has, but without some of those drawbacks that I drew attention to. Okay, thank you so much. Sorry, I went a couple minutes long, but